So I'm Todd Arrington. I'm the site manager down the street at James A. Garfield National Historic Site. It is me. I know you may not recognize me now that I have to wear glasses, but what's that quote from George Washington about, you know, I've not only grown old in the service of my country, but also blind? Well, that's me. So putting together these PowerPoints and everything has made me blind, so now I have to wear glasses. So, but again, we got to give the people what they want. So I'm here today to talk to you about Winfield Scott Hancock, one of probably the most famous Civil War personalities on the Union side, widely regarded as probably the greatest corps commander of all of the Union armies throughout the entire Civil War. And if you haven't been down the street to James A. Garfield National Historic Site, first of all, shame on you. Secondly, Hancock has great significance to us down the street as well, and I'm not going to tell you why yet. I know some of you know. I know certainly this whole first row knows. But if you don't know why Hancock is also very significant to us, you will find that out through the course of this program. I'm not going to embarrass you all right now and ask you how many of you know what I'm talking about, but I suspect many of you probably do. So like any, 45 or 50-minute program, this is just a glimpse at Hancock's life. He, like James Garfield, lived through very tumultuous times, played a huge role in the history of the Civil War and even the post-war period, and lived into his 60s. So there's only so much we can say about somebody like that in 45 or 50 minutes. So if this program only really scratches the surface of Hancock's life, and that's exactly what it's going to do, I am sure that Meredith or somebody upstairs would be happy to point you in the direction of maybe some books about Hancock or maybe some resources they have here at the Mentor Public Library that will help you learn a little bit more about the man. So let's learn a little bit about who Hancock was, where he came from, how he kind of rose to be this very important person in American history. He was born on Valentine's Day. I'm not sure if it was Valentine's Day in 1824, but Hancock was born in February of 1824, just northwest of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is kind of right down here. So this is where the county in which Hancock was born. He was a twin. He had an identical twin brother, and his dad had a great name, Benjamin Franklin Hancock. You can't do much better than that if you're looking to make your mark in American history. So Hancock is a Pennsylvanian. He's born in Pennsylvania, and even though he goes and lives in many different parts of the country throughout his life, he always considers Pennsylvania his home. And he's named for this guy, Winfield Scott. So if you know anything about American military history, the name Winfield Scott is one of the most preeminent names in American military history. Scott had a military career that lasted 50 years or more. He first went into the Army during the War of 1812, and he was still on active duty when the Civil War began. He was the General-in-Chief of the Army when the Civil War began. He was very famous, very prominent, very well known, and he is in fact the namesake of Winfield Scott Hancock. And so it's ironic that as we go through this program, you'll learn that at one point Winfield Scott Hancock actually served under Winfield Scott. Something else interesting about Scott that will come into play here a little bit later in our program is that Winfield Scott ran for president while on active duty in the U.S. Army, ran for president as a Whig in 1852. Needless to say, that could not happen today. But in 1852, the rules were a little bit different. Scott ran for president, but since you've never heard of President Winfield Scott, you know that he lost. He actually lost to Franklin Pierce, who was the Democratic candidate that year. So Scott was still on active duty when the Civil War began. He was very old, very, not in great health at that point, and soon after the war began, he retired, and he was kind of replaced by George McClellan. And we've talked about McClellan in a couple of these programs over the years as well. So Scott had a very long and very illustrious career. This is obviously a colorized image of what was originally a black and white photo, but some of these colorized images, and you can find them online, are really good. Some of them are terrible, don't get me wrong, but some of them are really good and I think really add a little bit of life to the person and give you an idea of what they might really have genuinely looked like if you were to meet them in person, and I think this is one of the ones that does that. Scott was also, notably, he was extremely tall. He was about 6'5", so he was a huge guy. I mean, that's huge now, but for that period, he was a very, very tall, kind of imposing guy. And Hancock himself grew up to be quite large as well, about 6'2", and so a very sort of tall and imposing figure as well. So this is the namesake of Winfield Scott Hancock. And there's our first look at Hancock. Now, again, this is, an image of Hancock from when he's, a two-star general. So obviously this is not him as a young man. He's, probably into his 40s or so, maybe late 30s, early 40s at this point. But I just wasn't able to really put my hands on any childhood, or even really, I even looked to try to find a photo of Hancock when he was at West Point, and I couldn't find that. So anyway, I don't have any photos of Hancock as really a young man. He did attend some of the public schools around Norristown, Pennsylvania, which is still there near Philadelphia, and then went to the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, in 1840, and graduated in the class of 1844. And he was 18th out of a class of 25, so, he was not a great student, obviously, but he didn't finish last like George Custer. So, and as is still the case today, when candidates are about to, or cadets are about to graduate, they kind of are able to select where they would like to go. They don't always get their first choice. But in this case, Hancock received his commission as a second lieutenant into the infantry. So there was infantry, artillery, cavalry, engineers, that kind of thing. So he went into the, he received his commission in the infantry. So his career was that of an infantry officer. I just thought you'd be interested in a few other notable names from the same class that Hancock was in at West Point. Alfred Pleasanton made his mark as a cavalryman and eventually was the head of cavalry for the Army of the Potomac. Alexander Hayes here on the right was a general as well, received the Medal of Honor for actions at Gettysburg, and then was later killed at, I believe, Spotsylvania. So Hayes did actually die during the war. These two gentlemen, Pleasanton and Hayes, stayed loyal to the Union, fought for the North. And then Simon Bolivar Buckner, who graduated with Hancock, eventually became a general in the Confederate Army. So these are probably the three, other than Hancock himself, the three best-known Civil War era personalities from the class of 1844. There's a great book out there, it's several years old now, called The Class of 1846, which is the class I believe McClellan was in, and just tons of other really important Civil War figures. And I was hoping that I would find some of those, something similar here with the class of 44, but these are probably the three most famous guys, and besides Hancock himself, from the class of 1844. So as I said, Hancock was commissioned into the infantry. His first assignment was with the 6th Infantry. This is the insignia of the 6th right here. And he went to what was basically called at the time Indian Territory, which doesn't really tell you much because it's this massive kind of swath of land. But he didn't stay there very long, because not too long after he got there, he graduated in 1844, and by 1846 the U.S. was at war with Mexico. So like every good soldier, every good officer trying to make his name and make his career, he wanted to go lead troops in the Mexican-American War. So he, as he was trying to make his way in Indian Territory as a young lieutenant, he was also trying to get himself reassigned so he could make sure and get into the action in Mexico. He did not want to be stuck not fighting in the Mexican-American War. And probably the best comparison I can make there, does anyone know where Dwight Eisenhower spent World War I? He did not spend it in Europe fighting. He spent it stateside at a training facility called Camp Colt, which is in Gettysburg. Which is why the Eisenhowers got to know and fell in love with Gettysburg. And so, Gettysburg is a minor footnote in this story as well about Hancock. But at any rate, Eisenhower's example in the early 20th century, Hancock did not want that to be his story as well with the Mexican-American War. He wanted to be involved. And so he was doing everything he could to get himself reassigned to Mexico. And he thought he'd had some success, and then he found out they were sending him to Kentucky to recruit soldiers. So he didn't want to be a recruiter either. So eventually he did get himself assigned to Mexico. His unit, the 6th U.S. Infantry, was sent to Mexico, and eventually, they got there before he did, but eventually after doing some of that recruiting duty in Kentucky, he was able to join them in Mexico, and he did fight in the Mexican-American War. And as I said earlier, he was fighting under General Winfield Scott. So here you have General Winfield Scott commanding the Army, and then Lieutenant Winfield Scott Hancock fighting under Scott. And so the first real combat that Hancock experienced was at the Battle of Churubusco in August of 1847, and this is just an artist's rendition of Churubusco. So Hancock performed very well at Churubusco. He was brevetted to a first lieutenant, which is basically like an honorary rank, more responsibility but the same pay. That still happens in the Park Service too sometimes. So Hancock was commissioned as a brevet first lieutenant for gallantry. He was also wounded. It wasn't a real serious wound. It was a wound in the knee, but he got sick. The wound got infected, and he eventually developed a fever. And so he actually missed really the main action of this campaign, which was the final push to Mexico City. And this was something that really troubled him for the rest of his life, or at least until the Civil War came along, because he certainly got his fair share of fighting during the Civil War. But at least for the next 15 years or so, this was something that really troubled Hancock, that he felt bad that he had been gone down with this very minor wound that got infected, and then he missed the final push to Mexico City. So after the Mexican-American War, the war lasts until 1848, so it's a relatively short conflict, about 2 years or so. The U.S. wins, and there's all this controversy about the treaty that's signed to end the war. A lot of very famous Americans, including U.S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln, all were very sort of disgusted by the Mexican-American War. They saw it as kind of a Southern plot to gain more territory so that slavery could expand. Read Grant's memoir sometimes and see what he has to say about the Mexican War. It was really not a kind assessment at all. And then Lincoln was a congressman at this point, his one term in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was most famous for hurling insults at President James K. Polk, who in his mind, instigated the Mexican War. So after the Mexican-American War, Hancock comes back to the States, and he's sent to a couple different places. The peacetime army, both before the Mexican-American War and after, was there was a lot of moving around, but not a lot of promotion. So, you could stay in the Army for 30 years and retire as a captain. I mean, there was just not a lot of promotion opportunities. It was a very small force. You had this influx of troops during the Mexican War who are volunteers, who are not career military. And then as soon as the war is over, those guys go home. But the career soldiers like Hancock had to move around quite a bit. They spent a lot of time in some unfriendly places, like on the frontier, where there were a number of American Indian populations that did not want them there, understandably so. And so Hancock comes back to the U.S. after the Mexican-American War, works at Fort Snelling up in Minnesota, works at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, which is a very famous post. In St. Louis, he meets Elmira Russell, and this is one of the few photos I could find of her. And they get married in 1850. They have 2 children. Sadly, both of the children die before the parents. They did have grandchildren. Their son Russell had 3 children, but Russell actually ended up dying before both of his parents. So they did lose both of their children at relatively young ages, although certainly the son did grow up to be an adult. By 1855, after 11 years of active service, Hancock is promoted to captain and gets sent down to Florida. There's all kinds of unrest in Florida with the Seminoles, and so there's all kinds of additional fighting going on in places like Florida and other parts further west as well. Doesn't stay in Florida very long, gets sent in 1856 out to Fort Leavenworth, still exists today. This is during Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas is basically viewed as kind of a dress rehearsal almost for the Civil War. You have, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you have all these settlers rushing into Kansas who are, pro-slavery and anti-slavery, and it's very violent conflict trying to determine what type of state government is Kansas going to have. And so Hancock is one of the handful of Army soldiers that's there during Bleeding Kansas. And I use this image here. This is John Brown. John Brown, of course, from the raid on Harper's Ferry. Well, John Brown really kind of made his name in Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas conflict when, he was convinced that he was here on a mission from God to eradicate slavery, and if he had to lop off a few heads while he was doing it, no problem. So Brown actually really kind of made his name not for the raid on Harper's Ferry, at least initially, but in Bleeding Kansas, where he actively murdered some pro-slavery settlers along Pottawatomie Creek. So this is the image of Brown here from Bleeding Kansas. After Bleeding Kansas, the U.S. government decided it wanted to sort of control the Mormons out in Utah, and so they initiated a campaign against the Mormons. So Hancock is sent out to Utah, fights in what's known as the Utah War in 1857-58. This is the government's campaign against the Mormons. Then in 1858, after all of the festivities in Utah, Hancock is sent to Southern California. And this is where he was when the Civil War began. And some of his friends, fellow Army officers in Southern California, included Albert Sidney Johnston, pretty important to the history of the Civil War, and Lewis Armistead. And if you know anything about the Battle of Gettysburg, you know that Armistead's name and Hancock's are very much tied together, especially because of the Battle of Gettysburg. So the Civil War begins in April of 1861. Hancock returns to the East, trying to basically, again, like he did in the Mexican-American War, trying to find a command for himself. He returns east to work as a quartermaster, which is basically like the supply and logistics side of the Army, and then is promoted to Brigadier General in September of 1861. The war, of course, is already going on at that point. He gets assigned to an infantry brigade in the Army of the Potomac. So he becomes a brigade commander. He's now a one-star general, a brigadier general. And his nickname, Hancock the Superb, that I used for the title of this presentation, comes from the time that he was a brigade commander in the Army of the Potomac during the Battle of Williamsburg, which is one of the battles during the Peninsular Campaign, when George McClellan moves this massive Army of the Potomac sort of down the James River and up onto the peninsula to try to attack Richmond. Hancock is one of those commanders, and so during the Battle of Williamsburg, which is in May of 1862, Hancock basically leads kind of an attack that really he wasn't supposed to make. He was being very aggressive and really was trying to make a counterattack that he wasn't really supposed to make. And of course, since it worked, he's a genius, right? It's kind of like, in a football game, if the coach decides to go for two and they get it, oh, he's brilliant. But if they miss, he's an idiot. He should have kicked the extra point. Well, it's the same idea here. This attack worked, and so Hancock receives all these accolades. And McClellan, who's the commander of the Army of the Potomac, says in his report that goes back to Washington, as he's sort of, telling, and of course we all know what kind of reports McClellan wrote, when he was very busy usually talking about how he had saved the country yet again. But in this case, he did take time to mention Hancock's counterattack, and Hancock was superb today. So that's where the nickname Hancock the Superb comes from, is from this compliment from George McClellan in May of 1862 at Williamsburg. So just a quick review of some of the major battles that the Army of the Potomac fought, and in which Winfield Hancock played a pretty important role. Antietam, of course, is one of the most famous battles of the Civil War. The single bloodiest day in American history, 25,000 casualties in about 12 or 14 hours of fighting, just an absolutely brutal battle. In Maryland, September of 1862. So Israel Richardson is a division commander in the Army of the Potomac in the 2nd Corps, and Richardson is killed at Antietam, and so Hancock kind of has to fill in as the acting division commander of Richardson's division. And there's Richardson's name right there, so you can see kind of the southern part of the field, I guess you would say. Here's the Bloody Lane. There's Bloody Lane. The Sunken Road, sometimes it's called. One of the most brutal spots of fighting during the entire Battle of Antietam. These are, in fact, bodies in the road. So that's the part of the battlefield that Hancock was on during Antietam. And so Hancock kind of rushes to the field while the battle's already going on. And when he arrives, everyone assumes he's there to lead a counterattack, kind of like he did at Williamsburg, that earned him the name Hancock the Superb. But in fact, he's arriving on the field with orders from McClellan to hold position, not to counterattack. So he follows his orders this time, and he actually stays in that position. And so he does not lead a counterattack. A lot of people, even today, think he probably should have, but he ultimately can't be faulted because he had orders from the commanding general saying, don't attack. And he must not have done too badly because he was promoted to Major General just a couple of months after Antietam. Antietam is really one of the, I think, probably the most important battles of the war because it's the victory, and Antietam is considered a Union victory. Tactically, it was probably a stalemate. Strategically, it's a Union victory. It's the victory at Antietam that allows Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Union victory at Antietam is absolutely critical to the Union cause, and Hancock certainly is part of that. After Antietam comes Fredericksburg, and here's Hancock's name right here at Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg is a disaster for the Union, an absolute disaster. McClellan is fired by Lincoln not too long after Antietam because Lincoln recognizes Antietam as a victory and wants McClellan to do what? To push, to follow up, to keep chasing these Confederates down and destroy their armies in the field. And McClellan, like a lot of generals, is obsessed with capturing Richmond. And of course, guys like Lincoln and even James Garfield are saying, who cares about Richmond? What difference does it make if their armies are able to survive in the field? Destroy their armies and Richmond will die. And so Lincoln gets sick and tired of McClellan dragging his feet. One of those great dispatches from Lincoln about, will you please move, and McClellan says, I can't, my horses are too fatigued. And Lincoln writes back, well, will you pardon me for asking, what have your horses done since the Battle of Antietam to fatigue anything? And then also, if you're not going to use the army, can I borrow it for a little while? Lincoln is pretty highly regarded for his sense of humor. But at any rate, he replaces McClellan with Ambrose Burnside, who will be the subject of our talk in March, by the way, if you want to come learn about Burnside in March. He replaces McClellan with Burnside, and Burnside comes up with this master plan to kind of, cross the Rappahannock and push on to Richmond from that way. Again, here we go. We got to capture Richmond. And the result is the Battle of Fredericksburg on December 13th, 1862, and it's an absolute slaughter. The Union is attacking Marye's Heights, which is right here, which is this elevated position, and the Confederates are sort of entrenched up here, and Burnside keeps sending wave after wave after wave after wave in this suicidal frontal assault, which we'll see again here in a few minutes from the other side. Here's Hancock leading his division of the Second Corps during the Battle of Fredericksburg. It's a disaster. The Union is defeated. This is the battle at which Robert E. Lee at some point is sitting up here and supposedly says, as he's watching the artillery just destroy these Union troops continuing to come across the field, it's good that war is so terrible or we would grow too fond of it. So anyway, Hancock gets wounded again in the abdomen this time. Not as serious as it sounds, but still is wounded at Fredericksburg. And eventually the Union's forces pull back, and that is one of the most lopsided defeats of the entire Civil War for either side. After that, we have Chancellorsville a few months later, May of 1863. This is the battle that is really viewed as Robert E. Lee's masterpiece. Robert E. Lee was, basically was a West Point graduate, was a career Army officer, and everything he had ever been taught, he threw out at some of these battles, including at Chancellorsville, where they said, never, ever, ever split your forces. Always keep your forces concentrated. And Lee says, I think we'll just throw that out, and wins this master stroke of a battle at Chancellorsville. Hancock's division is involved at Chancellorsville, but unfortunately they're really just basically covering the withdrawal of the army after Joseph Hooker, who was the latest in the line of failed Union generals leading the Army of the Potomac, had again, promised all of this great success and then goes into battle against Lee and for lack of a better phrase, just kind of loses his nerve and eventually has to pull back. So Hancock's division is involved at Chancellorsville, mostly covering the retreat. The reason I use this image is also in that Chancellorsville is probably most famous for that's the site of Stonewall Jackson's death. Now, had Jackson lived, it's a little speculative history here. Who knows how the Civil War might have ended up differently? It's hard to say, but at any rate, the stories. Jackson is riding at night. He's shot accidentally by his own men. They amputate his arm, and then a few days later he dies. When he loses his arm, Lee says, he may have lost his left arm, but I've lost my right arm, meaning, his right-hand man was no longer with him. And then Jackson dies a few days later. So this is the battle that, while is considered Lee's most masterful battle, also was highly costly to the Confederate cause because it resulted in the death of Jackson. So there's a lot of uproar about Chancellorsville and what a mess it was and how really ill-conceived it was on the Union side. So this guy, Darius Couch, who's the commander of the Federal Second Corps from the Army of the Potomac, is so fed up with Joseph Hooker, who again was the latest Army of the Potomac commander who had replaced Burnside after the debacle at Fredericksburg. Couch transfers out of the Army. He's so fed up he doesn't want to even be in the Army of the Potomac anymore. This is Couch right here, another one of these, I think, pretty good colorized images. So because the Second Corps now needs a leader, and the most senior division commander and certainly the most experienced is Hancock, so this is when Hancock becomes the commander of the Second Corps. So here's an image of Hancock, again with the 2 stars of a major general, and then this is the headquarters flag of the Second Corps. So at this point, Hancock becomes the commander of the Second Corps, and this is the job he will keep now for the next year and a half or so, and we'll get into all of that. So Gettysburg is probably Hancock's most famous battle, the battle at which he was most directly involved, the battle at which he really kind of made his name and his fame. Gettysburg, George Meade becomes the latest commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker is fired just late June, replaced with George Meade. Meade is basically, this battle begins before Meade even gets to the field. Meade sends Hancock to Gettysburg on the first day after this guy, John Reynolds, is killed on the first day of the battle. So Reynolds is the commander of the First Corps. Hancock's the commander of the Second Corps. So Reynolds comes into Gettysburg. Reynolds is an interesting guy. He was somebody that had actually been offered command of the Army of the Potomac and turned it down because he said he couldn't command the Army if he was going to be constantly interfered with by Washington. Nobody in the Park Service says that, I can tell you that. But Reynolds also was interesting in that he's somewhat local. He's from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that's Lancaster, not Lancaster, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So he's somewhat local. So he's from, maybe an hour and a half or so away from Gettysburg. So like Hancock, he's a Pennsylvanian. He's fighting on not only in his native country, but now in his native state. So Reynolds comes into Gettysburg very early on the first day as the commander of the First Corps and is almost immediately killed, gets shot off of his horse, gets shot in the head, and dies right there on the field. So when Meade gets word of Reynolds' death, he sends Hancock with orders to take over command of the Union forces at Gettysburg until Meade arrives. So Hancock rides into Gettysburg and finds this guy, Oliver Howard, who's the commander of the 11th Corps, which does not have a great reputation. The 11th Corps are the ones who are primarily German. They were attacked at Chancellorsville and kind of retreated because they were not ready to fight. They have now, at the first day at Gettysburg, also kind of retreated through the town. So Howard's Corps does not have a great reputation. So when Hancock arrives in Gettysburg, he finds Howard and tells him, General Meade has put me in command, and Howard says, no, because I'm senior to you. So they actually kind of have this argument about command right there on the battlefield, and eventually Howard relents, and Hancock is there with orders from the commanding general, and again, Meade's been the commanding general for about 3 days at this point, but Hancock really, as much as anyone, is responsible for the Union position at Gettysburg. This is Cemetery Hill. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, that gate tower is still there as the entrance to the one side of the cemetery. So Hancock is the guy that really recognizes the value of the ground at Gettysburg, recognizes Cemetery Hill as a very advantageous position, and establishes Cemetery Hill as kind of the Union center, and then directs the Union to fan out into this line, which sort of famously is known as a fish hook, which I don't have an image of that here, but kind of looks like something of a fish hook. So really Hancock, as much as anybody, is responsible for the Union disposition of forces at Gettysburg. And then that night, around midnight or so, Meade finally rolls into town and has this meeting with all the generals. Should we fight here? Or should we pull back and maybe back down into Maryland and fight there along Pipe Creek, which is what Meade kind of wanted to do. And Hancock is one of the guys that very vocally says, no, this is good ground. We need to fight it out here. So Hancock really, as much as anybody, probably more than anybody, more so than even Meade, is responsible for the Union position at Gettysburg. So that's the end of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. The end of the second day, the beginning of the second day. So here's that, I guess I do have an image. It's kind of that fishhook line. This is the Union right starting here around Culp's Hill and then coming down, and it was supposed to go all the way down here to Little and Big Round Top. But unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way. But as you can see, there's Hancock's name right there. So this is the position of the 2nd Corps, and then here's Dan Sickles commanding the 3rd Corps. So at the beginning of the second day of the battle, Sickles' corps is actually basically lined up here with Hancock. So Sickles' left is up here on Big Round Top. Sickles decides he doesn't like the ground. And if you've ever been to Gettysburg, why anyone would not like this ground, I still can't understand it after all these years. He decides, well, actually I do know a little bit. What he wants to move forward into the peach orchard here because it reminds him of a position from Chancellorsville that he wanted to move to and was told no, he could not. And his troops ended up getting decimated at Chancellorsville. So Sickles, who, by the way, is one of the quote-unquote dreaded political generals, not a professional, not a West Pointer, Sickles decides, he asks Meade several times to move his corps forward. Meade, being a good West Point trained guy who knows how to read a map, says, I don't think so. We're going to keep our line straight here. We're going to keep the fish hook together. So Sickles eventually just says, oh, the heck with it. I'm a politician. I can do whatever I want. And he moves his entire corps forward. So he creates a salient here. He breaks the line with Hancock, gives up the high ground on Little and Big Round Top, and moves his corps forward to the peach orchard and the wheat field. Now, if you know anything about the Battle of Gettysburg, there's an entire publishing industry talking about this aspect of the battle. Was Sickles an idiot for moving his position? Certainly without permission, yeah, that wasn't so smart. But did he inadvertently save the day? Because, of course, what happens as soon as he moves his corps forward, Longstreet's Confederate corps comes plowing through, trying to seize the high ground there at the Round Tops. If Sickles' corps had still been where it was supposed to be, who knows what would have happened? Because certainly Longstreet's corps would have attacked in much greater strength. But because they had to deal with Sickles' exposed 3rd Corps in order to get around to the Round Tops, maybe Sickles did kind of inadvertently save the day. I don't know. I know that years and years later, Longstreet wrote Sickles a letter where he said, oh, there's no question that your exposed position was the key to the battle. You saved the day for the Union. And Sickles, of course, being Sickles, said, told you. At any rate, Meade is understandably furious. So Hancock's corps, the 2nd Corps, basically has to provide support to the Union left on the second day at Gettysburg because now Sickles has moved his whole corps. By the way, Sickles loses his leg at Gettysburg. He gets knocked off by a piece of shrapnel from a cannon. So Sickles is pretty severely wounded not too long after all this happens. But at any rate, Hancock's corps has to kind of swing out and then become the Union left and provide support to the Union left because of Sickles' line being exposed. And of course, when Hancock starts moving his units forward, here comes A.P. Hill's corps across the open fields from the Confederate position on Seminary Ridge and plows right into Hancock's corps. So then there's the famous story of the 1st Minnesota. Basically, Hill's corps is starting to charge across the field. Hancock realizes he needs time to bring up more troops because there's this salient now between his line and Sickles. And so he sends one regiment, the only regiment that he has available, and a regiment is, at full strength is 1,000 men, and this is not a full-strength regiment. He sends one regiment against a brigade, which is about 4 regiments. So he sends the 1st Minnesota, and there's the 1st Minnesota's monument at Gettysburg. That's the Pennsylvania monument back in the back there. But this is the 1st Minnesota's monument. He sends the 1st Minnesota in for what basically amounts to a suicide mission to try to slow down this Confederate brigade long enough for him to be able to bring up more troops. And the 1st Minnesota's casualty rate in that action is about 87%. So it's very significant, and this is a Don Troiani showing the 1st Minnesota going into action against that Confederate brigade. So on the 3rd day of the Battle of Gettysburg, basically, everybody knows, Robert E. Lee's plan on the 3rd day as well. We've tried to hit them on the flanks, and they're strong on the flanks, so they must be weak in the middle, and that's where we get Picketts Charge, or as it's accurately known, Longstreet's assault. So on the 3rd day of the battle is the very famous Picketts Charge, and that is going to come right at Hancock's line. So here's Hancock's line right here, and the the Picketts Charge, or Longstreet's assault, about 15,000 Confederate troops going to cross this field and attack the Union Center. And of course, again, the Union Center is Winfield Scott Hancock's line. And so this is a Dale Gallen image of Hancock riding along. There's that Second Corps flag. Hancock riding along the line during the artillery bombardment that preceded Pickett's charge, basically encouraging the men, telling them to maintain their positions, don't fire too early, this kind of thing. So we're really just being seen. He's really just being seen, trying to buck up his soldiers and really keep them in place, because he knows that this artillery bombardment is preceding a massive frontal assault, and that's exactly what happens. So this is when we have the famous story of Armistead right here, putting his hat up on his sword and leading his Confederates across and really breaching the Union line and then, getting shot. And Armistead was one of those guys that was a good friend of Hancock's during their days in California right before the war. And so there's that famous story where Hancock basically goes down and a Union officer comes to assist him, and he hands. I put it was his Bible here, but there's some say his Bible and some say his pocket watch. I'm not sure exactly what, but this guy, this Captain Henry Bigham was his name, that actually came to render aid to Armistead, was one of Hancock's aides, and so Armistead asked Bigham to pass this item along to Hancock, because Armistead is obviously thinking he's not going to make it, and he was right. He died a couple of days later. And this is the friend-to-friend Masonic Memorial at Gettysburg, showing Armistead and Henry Bigham right here in that moment where Armistead is handing over, whether it's the watch or the Bible, I'm not sure. But apparently, supposedly, and I say supposedly because I don't know how true this is, Armistead, as he was lying there wounded, started calling out for help and used some kind of a Masonic, because he was a Mason, some kind of a Masonic greeting or something, and Bingham, also a Mason, heard that. And so anyway, this monument has been at Gettysburg. I think it's probably about 20 or 25 years old now, but relatively new for monuments at Gettysburg. It's actually in the cemetery, in the annex of the National Cemetery there. So Hancock, unfortunately, cannot go to Armistead's side himself, because Hancock has also been severely wounded at this battle. So he's on his horse, and of course, being on horseback at this time is almost suicidal, because there's just all of this chaos and all of this firing, cannons and muskets. So he's sitting on his horse, and a bullet basically passes through the pommel of the saddle, through the pommel, and goes into his thigh. And it carries wood and a nail and all kinds of stuff out of the saddle into his leg. So this is a very serious wound. He's very badly injured. He almost bleeds to death. And of course, I love this quote where he's saying, "They must be hard up for ammunition when they throw such shot as that," meaning the nail and the wood fragments and all this stuff. But it was a very, very serious injury. And so he was very, very, very injured, bleeding very badly. Refused to be evacuated until the battle was decided, but this wound really gave him trouble for the rest of his life. And there's a lot of Civil War soldiers like that were, got these wounds that were still bothering them 50 years later. Joshua Chamberlain, another one at Gettysburg, although he was wounded at Petersburg, same thing, had this very, very significant wound that bothered him for the rest of his life. And in Chamberlain's case, he lived until 1914, so, but these things bothered them for the rest of their lives. Medical science not being quite what it is today. Here's the monument that shows where Hancock was wounded at Gettysburg on July 3rd during Pickett's charge. So Hancock, after the wound, goes home to Philadelphia, recuperates for really the next about 8 or 9 months. And then rejoins the Army in time for the Overland Campaign. This is the campaign, Grant has now been brought to the east by Lincoln because, he fights, as Lincoln says. I can't spare this man. He fights, meaning Grant. He's finally the kind of general that Lincoln wants, somebody who is relentless and wants to go after the Confederate armies. So the Overland Campaign is basically those clashes in Virginia from the spring to the fall of 1864, the campaign season, I guess you would say, during 1864. So Hancock comes back to the Army, and then immediately the Overland Campaign begins, and this is where we get battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. This is actually the Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania. So Hancock is there leading the Second Corps through all of these major battles. Here's a great image of Hancock sitting with three of his division commanders. That's Francis Barlow right there. Was also a great story about Barlow from the Battle of Gettysburg, wounded severely on the first day at Gettysburg. So that's Barlow, that's David Birney, and then one of my favorites, John Gibbon. Gibbon was a pretty hardcore guy. Gibbon was born in North Carolina, so he's one of those, kind of like George Thomas. You know, he stayed loyal to the Union, and it cost him his relationship with some of his family members because they were dyed-in-the-wool rebels, and he was staying loyal to the North. But anyway, and then of course this is Hancock sitting here. So these are three of his division commanders during the Overland Campaign. The only real defeat that Hancock ever experienced was during the Overland Campaign at Reams Station during the Petersburg Siege. And this is Henry Heth right here, sometimes referred to as Heath. I always call him Heth because that's the way it's spelled. But I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong on that, to tell you the truth. I know the spelling is right, but I don't know about the pronunciation. So some of Heth's, and Heth also played a major role at the first day at Gettysburg. But some of Heth's troops came and overran Hancock's troops at Reams' station. And so that was really the most significant defeat that Hancock suffered during the Civil War. By late 1864, Hancock is in such discomfort from that wound, that leg wound at Gettysburg, that he finally decides he can't stay in the field anymore, and so he gives up command of the Second Corps. Over 40,000 Second Corps troops had become casualties in 1864 alone, not along, that's supposed to be alone, apologies. And that just speaks to the relentlessness and the savagery of that warfare in 1864, but it also speaks to Grant's overall strategy, which is what appealed to Lincoln about Grant, because that Grant famously saying, I'll fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. He is willing to continue to sacrifice men to to obtain the objective, which is to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. So Hancock leaves the Second Corps. He did get promoted to Brigadier General in the regular Army. Keep in mind, the regular Army and the Volunteer Army were two different things. So his rank really was in the Volunteers at that point. But in 1864, he's promoted to Brigadier General in the regular Army, and then a Brevet Major General in the regular Army as of March of '65, right as the war is ending. So here's a great quote from Grant. Hancock stands as the most conspicuous figure of all the general officers who did not exercise a separate command. So this is a great sort of lengthy quote from Grant about Hancock. Now, I will say, this is the only Grant quote I have in here, but I will say not every quote that Grant made about Hancock was favorable. But this one, in fact, from his personal memoirs, which again is highly regarded as probably one of the greatest memoirs in American history, he did single out Hancock as being highly effective as a Corps commander, and that is Hancock's reputation even today, probably the greatest Union Corps commander of the entire war. Hancock's life nor his career end when the Civil War ends, though. In fact, he continues on. He's assigned to supervise the execution of the Lincoln conspirators. And this photo is of several of those conspirators hanging on July 7th, 1865. One of them was Mary Surratt, I believe the first woman ever executed by the U.S. government. All of the other conspirators had sworn up and down that she had nothing to do with it, but she was found guilty anyway, and President Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln was assassinated, refused to pardon her, and therefore she was executed along with the others on July 7th. So this was Hancock, I don't know is in this picture, but certainly was there that day and was basically supervising the execution. And then here's Andrew Johnson, the president after Lincoln died. Johnson is a Democrat, which is one of the reasons, probably the main reason he was put on the ticket with Lincoln in 1864. He's a loyal Southern Democrat, so he's a great example of how the Union can come back together. And of course, never mind that he's a dyed-in-the-wool racist and all this other stuff, because hey, he's vice president. Who cares? Vice president. He can't do any damage in the vice presidency, except Lincoln gets assassinated, and that, of course, makes Andrew Johnson president. So even though Johnson is loyal to the Union, he is also he is a racist, he is a white supremacist, and he has no interest at all in ensuring the civil and political rights of African Americans in the South after the war is over, after slavery has been abolished. So he's very unhappy with all of these Republican generals who are military governors in the South. Because now, keep in mind, the South had kind of, after the war, was broken up into these various military districts, and they were run by Army generals, and many of these generals were Republicans. Hancock is the exception. He's a Democrat. He's a lifelong Democrat. So Johnson decides Hancock is the guy that really needs to be down south because he will agree more with Johnson. Johnson has tried and is trying to institute Lincoln's lenient Reconstruction policy, but Johnson also is making no effort at all to guarantee any kind of physical security for black men and women in the South. So President Johnson orders U.S. Grant, who by this time is the commanding general of the U.S. Army, to move Hancock to the command of the 5th Military District, which is headquartered in New Orleans. Grant does so because he has been ordered to do so by the president. So here's Hancock a little bit later in his career. He's gotten a little bit heavier and his beard is getting gray and all that. Hancock issues this General Order Number 40, which is really considered to be the thing that made Johnson really like him because it was taken as being sort of an endorsement of the Democratic side of the issue of the social and economic system in the South rather than the Northern or the Republican side of the debate. So this is really why Johnson wanted Hancock in a position of power in the South. And Hancock basically was revered in the South by Southerners for his fair treatment of white Southerners during Reconstruction. He was very much liked by Andrew Johnson, and white Southerners really viewed him as somebody a Yankee that they could appreciate. They didn't have to call him a damn Yankee; they just call him a Yankee. At any rate, African Americans obviously did not feel so great about Hancock because they felt like he was doing everything he could to turn all of the power back over to white Southerners and to the Democratic Party. So Hancock became very popular among Democrats, and in the 1868 Democratic Convention actually got a few, even though he was not at all a candidate, got a few votes for president. And one of those not so kind comments from Grant about Hancock that I didn't put in here was that basically once Hancock got these couple of votes at the 1868 Democratic Convention, he got the presidential fever and he would never let it go. And so, and in Grant's mind, that really impacted how Hancock served and lived for the rest of his life. Now, of course, in 1868, Grant becomes president. So now he is in charge of Reconstruction. And the Republican Party is now firmly in control of all aspects of Reconstruction. Congress, the House, the Senate, everything is Republican now. And so Grant wants Hancock out of there because he thinks Hancock is frankly dangerous in that position. So he ships Hancock off to the west, sends him out to the Department of Dakota, which is modern Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and Montana. In 1872, however, George Meade dies, and that makes Hancock the senior major general in the U.S. Army. So at this point, he's entitled to a more prominent command than the Department of Dakota, and so Grant brings him back to the east and sticks him out here on this little island right off of New York City. This is the command of the Division of the Atlantic, and this is Governor's Island right here, which is where the Division of the Atlantic is headquartered. Hancock comes east, goes to Governor's Island. He's still on active duty, but he's sort of now starting to stoke the fires a little bit of his own for a future presidential run. In 1876, the Democrats run Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York, as their presidential candidate, and everybody knows the famous story about the Tilden-Hayes election where Tilden wins the popular vote, but they can't decide who won the electoral vote, and eventually they create this commission, one of whose members is James Garfield, by the way, who eventually decides Hayes, not Tilden, legally won South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Therefore, he, by one electoral vote, is going to be the president, not Tilden. So the Democrats, even though they're crushed by what happens in 1876, Tilden does not become president, they see an opportunity. They know that 1880 might be their chance to finally win the White House. They haven't elected a Democratic president since James Buchanan in 1856. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, but he was not elected. He was elected vice president under Lincoln. He only became president because of Lincoln's death. So the Democrats recognize 1880 as their chance. So here's a civilian image of Hancock, looking quite dapper now with just the mustache and the soul patch there, wearing civilian clothing. So Hancock had great appeal in the Democratic Party. One, Southerners loved him. Southerners loved him because of that time that he was in command of the 5th Military District. But he also fought for the Union. So Hancock has great appeal as a loyal Democrat, somebody who's acceptable to the South, and the Republicans cannot beat him over the head with the bloody shirt. The bloody shirt meaning, the old Republican bag of tricks where anytime you're running an election, all you have to do is say, well, that Democrat didn't fight for the Union, or that Democrat tried to destroy the Union, or that Democrat didn't favor the Emancipation Proclamation. We, the Republicans, we're the party of emancipation and Lincoln and saving the Union. That's waving the bloody shirt. How do you wave the bloody shirt at a guy who fought for the Union, went to West Point, served his whole career in the Army, was wounded several times? It's hard to wave the bloody shirt at this guy. So he has great appeal for the Democrats. And in fact, he is nominated for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1880. So Hancock becomes the presidential candidate in 1880. William H. English from Indiana becomes the vice presidential candidate. English has been out of politics for years, so he's put on the ticket more for geographic reasons than anything else. So that brings me to my original question, which was, why is Hancock so important to us? And the reason is, this guy ran for president in 1882. So Hancock runs against James Garfield in 1880. So this is the Republican ticket in 1880, Garfield and Arthur. Now Garfield has an impressive military record, right? Joins the Union Army at the beginning of the war, wins some victories, including the Battle of Middle Creek, fought on this day, January 10th, 1862. Goes to Congress during the war. Garfield's got a pretty impressive military record, but it's nothing compared to Hancock, right? It's nothing compared to Hancock. So is Garfield going to be able to beat Hancock over the head with the bloody shirt in 1880? He'll try, but it's not going to be as easy as it would have been if he was running against a Democrat who had never served the Union, right? So Garfield, I think, has a very significant challenge in 1880, which is to win an election when he can't really ride on that particular issue. Now, of course, he's going to do it to a point. He's going to talk about the Republican Party and the party of Lincoln and all that, but he can't have nearly as much. He can't assume that that's going to be enough. He's got to do more. So the reason that we're so interested in Hancock right down the street here in Mentor is because he ran against James Garfield in 1880. So here's the breakdown of the election of 1880. This is the first instance in American history where we have a solid South. Every single Southern state votes for Hancock. Now we have a solid South today. It's a little reversed, right? Or relatively solid. It's really not as solid as it has been in some recent elections. The South's been fairly Republican now for several years, but this is the first instance really of the solid South. But in order to win, Hancock needed to turn at least a couple of northern states his way, and he just wasn't quite able to do it. And in fact, New York becomes the really critical state, just as it was 4 years earlier in the Hayes-Tilden election when Tilden won New York. He was from New York. He thought he had it made, and that was not the case. And in fact, it's New York that puts Garfield over the top in this election. So from an electoral standpoint, it's a pretty significant victory for Garfield and the Republicans. But from a popular vote standpoint, you guys all know we have this thing called the Electoral College. We don't actually elect presidents based on popular vote, right? Look at the difference here. 48.3% popular vote to 48.2%. The closest election in American history. So if somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people had voted for Hancock instead of Garfield, Hancock would have been president. And how do you think Hancock felt about this? was devastated, right? No, actually he wasn't. Believe it or not, when Hancock was told, you lost by this much, he said, well, that's the way it's supposed to be then, and he went back to bed. He accepted his defeat very much in stride. He returned to the command of the Division of the Atlantic. He graciously attended Garfield's inauguration. He took on a number of other responsibilities, president of the National Rifle Association, commander-in-chief of Military Order of the Loyal Legion, and then, of course, because he was still the commanding general of the U.S. Army when Grant died in 1885, one of Hancock's responsibilities was to actually preside over the funeral. So Hancock continued on active duty. Like his namesake, Winfield Scott, he ran for president. He didn't win, and he continued on with his active duty career. He died February 9th, 1886, just a few days before his 62nd birthday. This is his grave site in Montgomery, or Norristown, rather, PA. And you can see there's a fence around it. They're trying to keep people out because a lot of Hancock admirers come and try to get up close to the grave. And his wife survived him until 1893, so she did live a few more years after him. And one of the things that she did after his death was she actually wrote this book. This is not Hancock's book. This is his wife's book. Elmira Hancock wrote this book, Reminiscences of Winfield Scott Hancock. And then, of course, the clover leaf there is the symbol of the Second Corps. And then just a look at a few of the statues. This is in Washington, D.C. That's a Hancock statue there in Washington. This is in Philadelphia. And then this, of course, is Cemetery Hill at Gettysburg. So Hancock is, as I said, one of the most highly regarded Union commanders of the entire war. Lived a really fascinating life. And again, we like Hancock because he ran against Garfield. We're glad he lost. Perhaps the house down the street would not be quite as significant had Garfield not been president, although he certainly would have lived a much longer life. But at any rate, Hancock really is an important guy in American history, and it's been kind of fun to reacquaint myself with him as I was putting this together. So, does anyone have questions about anything? Sure.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
First of all, why wasn't General Couch promoted to General of the Army after Antietam?
Boy, I'm not sure about that. Was he?
Because he always worked well with Hancock, and I think the outcome would have been a lot different. So I think it would have been a lot.
You mean why didn't he replace McClellan when Lincoln fired McClellan?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Oh, okay. I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that question. I can speculate that Lincoln chose Burnside because he wanted an Easterner. It was an Eastern army. He wanted an Easterner, and Burnside was a political general too, wasn't he? I mean, he wasn't a West Pointer or anything like that, so it may have been a political consideration as well. Yeah, it may have been a political consideration as well.
My second question is, when did Armistead graduate from West Point?
Oh gosh, Armistead.
I thought it was the same year as Hancock.
I don't think so. Because didn't Armistead get left back a year? I think Armistead had to go one extra year because he got temporarily suspended because he got into a fight with Jubal Early, as did a lot of people. So I think Armistead, may have been a little before Hancock. I think they really got to know each other in Southern California, not at West Point. They may have been there at the same time, but I think Armistead probably graduated before Hancock. Sure.
Two questions. One, the Utah situation. I never heard about that. What exactly went on there? And number two, interesting that Hancock did not win his home state.
Yeah, well, you're right. He did not win his home state in 1870 or 1880 rather. Pennsylvania was still a northern state, still very Republican at that time, and we've certainly seen cases where in recent history, in fact, the last election, I think, Trump didn't win New York. So we have seen those cases where I recall Al Gore lost Tennessee in 2000 as well, if I remember correctly. So we don't always see candidates win their home states, but that is an interesting observation that yes, he did not win Pennsylvania. Now, granted, he had not lived full-time in Pennsylvania in many, many years, but yeah, he was a Pennsylvanian. But I think the ties of him being a native-born Pennsylvanian versus being a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat I think it was just not a strong enough appeal for enough people to vote for him to make Pennsylvania turn Democrat at that point. As far as the Utah situation, that basically, the 5-cent version is the U.S. Army was sent into Utah to really go after the Mormons because of polygamy. They were trying to, I wouldn't say eradicate Mormonism, but they were certainly trying to control Mormons because of polygamy.
Now, the Mormons weren't rebelling against the government.
I don't know enough about that situation to really say definitively, other than, polygamy was a major issue. And even Garfield's diary, Garfield even mentions polygamy a few times and kind of the barbarism of polygamy and all this kind of stuff. So, but I don't know that they were in active rebellion against the United States, but certainly the government wanted to control them as much as possible so that they could eradicate polygamy, either making the Mormons eradicate it by choice or forcing them to do so.
They were prepared for active rebellion.
Yeah, I don't think they were.
Yeah, no, they
Yeah,
weren't.
there weren't enough of them.
They had the cannons over the, and they were ready to fire in position.
Other questions?
The Mormons had forgotten.
You said Burnside is not a West Point guy. He graduated from West Point in 1847.
Burnside did?
Burnside did.
Why was I thinking? Well, he was later a politician then. He was a senator from Rhode Island, right?
Governor of Rhode Island later.
Okay.
Armistead
I misspoke. I apologize.
got thrown out of West Point.
Okay, so he never
He
graduated?
never graduated.
Oh, okay.
His father got him his position.
Okay, there you go. The magic of Google. That's right. Okay, well, I misspoke about Burnside then. I apologize. He was a West Pointer. I must have been thinking of him later as a senator and a governor.
And he, in 1847, so it's just a couple of years after.
Okay.
after him.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. Thank you, Google. Anybody else got questions? So next month, you'll have to suffer through me again with Wednesday the 14th. We're going to be, because it's almost President's Day, we're going to be talking about Civil War veterans as President of the United States next month. So that's February 14th right here at noon. Okay? All right. Thanks, everybody.